The gun was pressed against Andrew Haskins's chest before he even had a chance to reach for his own. Ruth Conley stood in the middle of Main Street, Caldwell, Kansas, on a scorching July afternoon in 1882, her dark hair wild from the wind, her green eyes blazing with something that went far beyond fury. The Colt Navy revolver in her hand did not tremble, not even slightly. And that, more than anything else, was what told Andrew that the situation was more dangerous than anything this town had thrown at him in 6 long years of wearing a badge. "You knew," she said, her voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow worse than screaming. "You knew who my husband really was, and you let him walk free." Andrew did not reach for his weapon. He did not step backward. He held her gaze with the full weight of everything he had never been able to say to her, and he let the accusation land where it was aimed. "Ruth," he said quietly, "put the gun down. Tell me I am wrong." Her jaw was tight. The barrel of the revolver pressed harder into the star pinned to his shirt. "Tell me you did not know that James Conley was working with Garrett Cole's operation before I ever set foot in this town. Tell me that, Andrew. Look me in the eye and tell me that, and I will put this gun down." The street had gone completely silent. 3 merchants stood frozen outside the general store. Elderly Tom Briggs from the telegraph office had pressed himself against the doorframe of his building. 2 cowboys on horseback had stopped their horses dead, and were watching with the careful stillness of men who had learned that certain moments in Caldwell were not to be interrupted. Andrew Haskins looked at the woman he had been in love with for 8 months, 3 weeks and 4 days, and he knew that the next words out of his mouth would either save everything or destroy it beyond repair. He did not lie to her. "No," he said, "I cannot tell you that." The gun did not go off, but something in Ruth Conley's face did. Something cracked open behind those green eyes, something raw and terrible and betrayed, and she took one slow step backward, then another, and the revolver dropped to her side as if her arm had simply forgotten how to hold it up. Andrew reached out and gently, carefully, took the weapon from her hand. She let him. And in that moment, surrounded by the dust and heat of a Kansas summer, with half the town watching and the weight of every secret he had ever kept pressing down on his chest, Andrew Haskins understood with absolute clarity that the hardest thing he had ever done in 6 years of law enforcement was not going to be stopping Garrett Cole. It was going to be earning back the trust of Ruth Conley. 8 months earlier, the town of Caldwell had looked like it always did in November. Gray sky pressing down on brown earth, the wind cutting sideways off the Kansas plains with a particular cruelty that only those who had lived through a prairie winter could properly describe. The cattle drives had wound down for the season, which meant the saloons were quieter, the streets were emptier, and Andrew Haskins had more time than he liked to sit behind his desk in the sheriff's office and think. He was 34 years old. He had been sheriff of Caldwell since 1876, appointed first as a temporary measure when the previous sheriff died of a fever, and then re-elected twice, because the town had gotten used to the idea of Andrew Haskins being the person who stood between them and whatever was coming. He was good at the job. He was honest about it and honest in it, which was rarer than people liked to admit, and he carried the badge with a kind of quiet seriousness that the citizens of Caldwell had come to find reassuring. He had also, in 6 years, never once found a reason to stay in Caldwell past retirement. He did the work because the work needed doing. He kept the peace because the peace was worth keeping. But there was a hollowness to it that he had stopped trying to name because naming it did not seem to help. Deputy Samuel Holt was the one who told him about the new arrival. "Stage came in from Dodge City," Samuel said, dropping into the chair across from Andrew's desk with the casual ease of a man who had been working alongside someone long enough to stop knocking. "Woman came in alone. Says she is meeting her husband. Name of Conley." Andrew glanced up from the report he was reviewing. "James Conley, that is what she said." Andrew set his pen down. James Conley had arrived in Caldwell 4 months prior, had set himself up in the cattle brokerage business, had a fine suit and a smooth way of talking and references from a firm in St. Louis that Andrew had been quietly, methodically, unable to fully verify. He had no outstanding warrants. He had paid his bills on time. He had attended church twice. He had also, in Andrew's considered professional opinion, the eyes of a man who was always calculating the distance to the nearest exit. "She is his wife," Andrew said. "Says she is. Married him last spring in Cincinnati. He sent for her 2 weeks ago." Samuel scratched the back of his neck. "She does not look like a woman who has been particularly well cared for, is all I will say. She looks like someone who has been traveling hard and worrying harder." Andrew stood up and reached for his coat. He told himself he was going to the stage depot because it was his job to know who was coming into his town. He told himself that every time a new resident arrived, it was good practice to make an introduction, to establish himself as the law, to ensure that vulnerable people knew they had somewhere to turn. He told himself all of these things, and every one of them was true. None of them were the real reason he walked to the stage depot at a pace that was slightly faster than his usual measured stride. Ruth Conley was standing outside the depot with a single worn trunk at her feet, and her arms crossed against the November cold when Andrew arrived. She was looking up and down the street with the kind of careful, assessing gaze that told him she was intelligent and not given to panic, even when she was clearly in an unfamiliar and not entirely comfortable situation. She was 27 years old, he would learn later. She had brown hair that was almost black in the dim November light, pulled back in a practical knot. She was not dressed expensively, but she carried herself as someone who had once had better options and had made peace with the fact that those options had narrowed. Her eyes, when they found him, were a shade of green that he had no previous frame of reference for. They were direct and assessing, and contained absolutely nothing of the practiced feminine deference that a lot of women in frontier towns wore like armor. "You must be the sheriff," she said. Not a question. "Andrew Haskins," he said. "Welcome to Caldwell, Mrs. Conley." "Ruth," she said, "is my husband here?" "He is not at the depot," Andrew said. "I can walk you to his place of business if you like. He has an office on Commerce Street." She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, as if she was reading something in his face that he had not intended to put there. Then she nodded, picked up the handle of her trunk and began to walk without waiting to see if he would follow. He took the trunk from her without asking. She led him without thanking him, which told him everything about how tired she was. They walked in silence for half a block before she said, "What is he like here?" "My husband. What is his reputation in this town?" It was a direct question, and she asked it without looking at him, which told him she expected a diplomatic answer and was bracing herself for the reality behind it. "He is considered a capable businessman," Andrew said carefully. She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "That is a very careful answer, Sheriff." "Most careful answers contain the truth," he said. "Just not all of it." She did stop then, and she looked at him, and something in the quality of her attention shifted in a way he felt more than he could explain. "I appreciate honesty," she said, "more than most people realize." "So do I," Andrew said. They looked at each other in the pale November light on a dusty Kansas street, and something passed between them that was not yet anything that either of them would have named, but that was nonetheless as real as the badge on his chest and the cold wind off the plains. James Conley came out of his office when he heard the commotion of the trunk being set down outside, and the look on his face when he saw his wife was not the look of a man who had been pining for her arrival. It was a look of calculation rapidly disguised as warmth, and Andrew catalogued it in the back of his mind the way he catalogued everything that mattered. "Ruth," James said, spreading his arms, "you made it." "I did," Ruth said, accepting his embrace with the controlled stillness of a woman who had learned to manage her expectations. "It was a long journey." "I am sure it was." James looked over her shoulder at Andrew with an expression that was polite and entirely opaque. "Sheriff, thank you for the escort." "My pleasure," Andrew said. He touched the brim of his hat to Ruth, and she held his gaze for just a moment before the door of the office closed between them. Andrew walked back to the sheriff's office in the cold, sat down at his desk, and stared at the wall for a long time before picking up his pen again. The weeks that followed were ordinary in their surface texture, and deeply unsettling in ways that Andrew kept to himself. Ruth Conley settled into the rooms above James's office with the efficient practicality of a woman who had moved before and knew how to make a space functional if not comfortable. She introduced herself to the women of the town with a quiet courtesy that quickly earned her a place in the Tuesday sewing circle, not because she was charming in an easy way, but because she was genuinely interested in people and had a way of listening that made them feel heard. Andrew crossed her path regularly, the way you do in a town of 400 people. He tipped his hat. She nodded. They exchanged words about the weather, about the state of the road after the November rains, about whether the new shipment at the general store had come in yet. Small things, safe things, but twice in those first weeks he saw bruises that she did not explain. The first time it was on her wrist, a band of darkened skin that she pulled her sleeve down to cover when she noticed him noticing. The second time it was along her jaw, lighter, already yellowing to the edge of healed, but unmistakable to someone who had seen enough violence to recognize its marks. Andrew said nothing, not because he did not want to, because he understood, with the painful clarity that came from 6 years of law enforcement in frontier Kansas, that women in Ruth Conley's position had almost no legal recourse in 1882, that a man had a right to discipline his wife under the prevailing legal interpretation of the day, and that moving too fast on an accusation he could not prove would most likely result in James Conley relocating and taking Ruth somewhere Andrew could no longer watch over her. So he watched. He paid attention. He made sure his office door was always open and the light in the window visible from the street at night. He also, in the privacy of his own sleepless thoughts, began to understand the specific nature of the hollowness he had been carrying for 6 years. It was December when the name Garrett Cole first came up in connection with James Conley. Andrew had a contact in Dodge City, a retired lawman named Perkins who had spent 20 years collecting information on the criminal networks that moved through the cattle corridor from Texas to Kansas. Perkins sent Andrew a letter in the first week of December that contained 3 paragraphs of ordinary news and 1 paragraph that Andrew read 4 times. The paragraph said that a man operating under the name of James Conley, matching the description Andrew had sent, had been identified in Dodge City 18 months ago as a financial intermediary for Garrett Cole's operation. Cole was a man Andrew knew well by reputation, a former Texas Ranger turned outlaw who had built a sophisticated network that combined cattle rustling, land fraud, and systematic intimidation of small ranch owners who refused to sell. Cole was wanted in Texas and Oklahoma territory. He had not, as yet, been confirmed operating in Kansas. Andrew sat with this information for 3 days. He sat with it because acting on it immediately without further evidence would accomplish nothing. Cole was careful and his people were more careful. James Conley had committed no provable crime in Caldwell. If Andrew moved prematurely and tipped his hand, both men would vanish, and the investigation would be dead. He also sat with it because he was deeply, uncomfortably aware that sitting on it meant leaving Ruth Conley in the same house as a man who worked for Garrett Cole and who put bruises on her wrists. It was the hardest thing he had done in 6 years of wearing the badge. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he was building something that would protect her permanently rather than move her from immediate danger into a larger one. He told himself that, and he believed it. And he also hated himself for it in the quiet of his office at 2 in the morning. In January, Ruth started working at the schoolhouse. The previous teacher had left in October to marry a man in Wichita, and the school board had been scrambling to find a replacement. Ruth had 3 years of teaching experience from before her marriage, a fact that emerged during one of the Tuesday sewing circle meetings, and within a week, She was standing in front of 22 children of various ages in the one-room schoolhouse on Oak Street, looking, by all accounts, more alive than she had at any point since arriving in Caldwell. Andrew watched this transformation from a careful distance and felt something warm settle in his chest that he was not sure he had business feeling. He started finding reasons to pass the schoolhouse in the mornings. The route from the office to the livery stable went past it if you took Oak Street instead of Main, which added approximately 40 feet to the walk, which was not a significant detour by any reasonable measure. He took Oak Street every morning. Sometimes he could hear her through the window. Her voice in the classroom was different from her voice in the street, fuller and more certain, as if the act of teaching stripped away the careful management she wore everywhere else and let something genuine through. He would hear her explaining fractions to a room full of restless 8-year-olds with a patience that was not falsely sweet but was instead deeply real, and he would walk on, and the warmth in his chest would spread a little further. In February, everything began to accelerate. A rancher named Dutch Hollies came into Andrew's office with a bruise of his own, this one across his cheekbone, and a story about 3 men who had come to his property the previous night with an offer to buy that had turned into a threat when he declined. The men had not identified themselves, but Hollies' description of the leader matched one of Cole's known associates so precisely that Andrew felt the pieces of the picture clicking into place. Cole was in Kansas. His operation was moving into Caldwell County, and James Conley was almost certainly the advance man, the one who had set up the financial infrastructure that would let Cole's money flow invisibly through a legitimate brokerage. Andrew sent another letter to Perkins. He also sent a wire to the U.S. Marshal's office in Wichita, carefully worded, requesting information on Cole's current whereabouts without tipping his full hand. While he was doing this, Ruth Conley knocked on the door of his office for the first time. She stood in the doorway with a piece of paper in her hand and an expression on her face that told him she had been debating this visit for some time before making it. He stood up immediately. "Come in," he said. She came in, looked at the chair across from his desk, and sat down without the self-conscious uncertainty that some people brought into the sheriff's office. She sat like someone who had made a decision and was committed to it. "I found something," she said, and put the paper on his desk. It was a page from what appeared to be a ledger, covered in columns of numbers and abbreviated codes, with 3 ranch names that Andrew recognized from Caldwell County in the margins. It was the kind of document that a criminal investigator would need a great deal of time and expertise to decode, but the ranch names alone were enough to tell Andrew that it was significant. "Where did you get this?" he asked, keeping his voice level. "James had a locked box in the bottom drawer of his desk," Ruth said. "He went to Wichita for 3 days last week. I used a hairpin." She paused. "I copied this page. I put the original back." Andrew looked at her across his desk. "That was dangerous," he said. "I know what my husband is," Ruth said. Her voice was steady and her eyes were direct, and there was nothing of self-pity in her face. "I have known for a long time. I need to know that someone with the authority to do something about it also knows." "What made you decide to tell me?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Because you are the only person in this town who has not pretended not to see," she said simply. Andrew held her gaze and understood that she was not talking only about James Conley's criminal activities. He wanted to say something to her then. He wanted to say something that would cross the careful professional distance he had maintained for 3 months, that would acknowledge what he had seen and what he felt about it and what he intended, if she would let him, to do about it. But he was still the sheriff and she was still a married woman, however miserably, and the moment was not right, and the situation was too dangerous for anything that was not completely controlled. "Thank you for bringing this to me," he said instead. "I need you to go home and behave exactly as you normally do. Do not give James any reason to think anything has changed. Can you do that?" "I have been doing it for years," she said, and stood up and left. Andrew sat down, picked up the ledger page, and stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and began the slow, careful work of trying to understand what he was looking at. March arrived with a thaw that turned the streets of Caldwell to mud and a sharp uptick in the tension that Andrew had been tracking. 2 more ranchers reported intimidation visits. A barn outside of town burned down in the middle of the night, and while the official determination was a lantern accident, Andrew knew from the pattern of the burn that it had been set deliberately. The marshal's office in Wichita sent a response to his wire. Garrett Cole had been spotted in southern Kansas as recently as 6 weeks ago. He was coming. Andrew met with Samuel and laid out what he knew, keeping his sources vague, explaining the shape of the operation without identifying Ruth's contribution. Samuel was a steady man who asked good questions and did not panic, and by the end of the meeting they had the outline of a plan that required patience and timing, and absolutely no premature movement. It also required keeping Ruth safe in a house with a man who was increasingly tense and unpredictable. Andrew found his opportunity to speak to her privately one afternoon in late March when she was locking up the schoolhouse, and the last of the children had scattered toward home. He fell into step beside her on Oak Street with the careful casualness of a man who had been in this town long enough to make casual coincidence plausible. "He is getting worse," she said, before he could speak. She said it quietly and without drama, looking straight ahead, and he understood that she had been waiting for a chance to say it too. "I know," he said. "I need you to know that I am working on something. I cannot tell you everything yet, but I need to know if you are in immediate danger." She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "He has not come at me in 3 weeks," she said. "He has been distracted, preoccupied. He is waiting for something." "Yes," Andrew said. "He is." She stopped walking and turned to look at him, and they were standing close together on the empty afternoon street with the sound of wind in the cottonwood trees and the distant noise of the saloon on Main Street, and the warmth between them was not subtle anymore. It had not been subtle for some time. "Are you going to tell me when it is safe to ask you the questions I actually want to ask you?" she said. He felt the words land in his chest like something that had been falling for a long time and had finally reached the ground. "Yes," he said. "When this is over, I am going to tell you everything." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I will hold you to that," she said, and walked on. April was the month the trap was set. Andrew had received word through Perkins that Cole was planning to come to Caldwell in the second week of May to finalize what appeared to be a significant land acquisition, one that would be funded through Conley's brokerage, and would serve as the mechanism for laundering a substantial sum of money. The acquisition involved 3 ranches whose owners had been the targets of the intimidation campaign. If Cole could acquire them cheaply through a combination of threats and a falsified title dispute that Conley had apparently been quietly engineering, he would own a corridor of land wide enough to move stolen cattle without ever crossing a property boundary he did not control. It was sophisticated, and it was patient, and it was, Andrew thought, the work of a man who was very used to winning. He sent for a U.S. Marshal. The marshal who arrived in the first week of April was a man named Cartwright, compact and humorless and thorough, who reviewed everything Andrew had assembled and agreed that they had enough to arrest Conley now and Cole when he arrived, provided they maintained absolute secrecy until the moment came. Which was the problem? Secrecy required that nothing change in Caldwell before Cole arrived, which meant James Conley continued operating freely, which meant Ruth remained in the position she was in. Andrew and Cartwright argued about this for 2 hours in the locked back room of the sheriff's office. Cartwright's position was that one woman's personal situation, however unfortunate, could not be allowed to compromise an investigation of this magnitude. Andrew's position was that human beings were not collateral, and that if there were any way to secure Ruth's safety without burning the investigation, they needed to find it. They found a compromise. Andrew would speak to Ruth privately, explain the situation in broad terms, and give her the option to leave on her own, ostensibly to visit a sick relative, which would remove her from the house without triggering James's suspicion. If she chose to stay, that was her decision as a grown woman, fully informed. He went to the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon, waited until the last child left, and told her most of the truth. He told her that her husband was under federal investigation. He told her that a significant arrest was planned for May. He told her that she did not have to stay in that house for another 30 days if she did not want to. She listened to all of it with the stillness that he had come to recognize as her particular form of courage, the absolute refusal to fall apart when falling apart would cost her something important. "What happens if I leave?" she asked. "Does it affect what you are building?" "Marginally," he said. "He might become suspicious. It might move his timeline up, but Cartwright and I believe we can manage it." "You are telling me I can leave?" "Yes. You are also telling me that if I stay, the plan is more likely to succeed." He looked at her and did not look away. "I am not asking you to stay. I would not ask you that." She was quiet for a moment. "What are you asking me?" "I am asking you what you want," he said. "What Ruth Conley, separate from all of this, actually wants." No one had asked her that in a very long time. He could see the recognition of it move across her face, and then something followed it that he could not name, but that made the warmth in his chest almost painful. "I want this town to be safe," she said finally. "I want the men who have been threatening those ranchers to answer for it, and I want," she paused, "I want to not have to be afraid anymore." "You will not have to be afraid," Andrew said, and the words carried more weight than their surface meaning, and they both felt it. She stayed. The weeks between April and May were the longest of Andrew Haskins's life. He had not previously understood that it was possible to be acutely, continuously aware of another person's well-being from a distance, without any legitimate mechanism to express that awareness. He checked on Ruth through what he told himself were routine patrols that happened to route past the brokerage building, through Samuel keeping a discreet eye on the comings and goings of James Conley, through the coded glances he and Ruth exchanged when their paths crossed in the street in front of anyone who might be paying attention. She was extraordinary. That was the word that kept surfacing in his thoughts, unasked and inconvenient. She taught 22 children every day with complete focus and genuine engagement, while living in a house with a man who was a criminal and who frightened her, while carrying the knowledge of an investigation that could unravel at any moment, while navigating the impossible in-between space of wanting something she could not yet allow herself to reach for. Extraordinary. He began writing letters that he did not send. He was not a man given to writing letters, and the first few attempts were embarrassing in their stiltedness, but somewhere around the 4th or 5th draft, he stopped trying to make them sound like something a man should properly say and started saying what was actually true, and the letters got better. He kept them in the bottom drawer of his desk, under the old county survey maps, and he thought about burning them and could not make himself do it. May arrived. The intelligence from Perkins put Cole's arrival at May 14th. By May 10th, Cartwright had quietly deputized 2 additional men from Wichita who took up positions in town that looked nothing like what they were. The plan was to let Cole arrive, let him meet with Conley, let them initiate the transaction, and take them at the moment the papers were signed when the evidence was at its most legally airtight. On the night of May 12th, 2 days before everything was supposed to go smoothly, something went wrong. Andrew was in the office when Samuel came in fast, his face tight. "Conley's light is on at 3 in the morning," Samuel said. "He has a visitor." Ryder came in quiet from the south end. Cole had arrived early. Andrew and Cartwright had 10 minutes to recalibrate everything. They sent one of the Wichita deputies around the back of the brokerage building and positioned Samuel at the eastern end of Main Street. Andrew walked to the front door of the brokerage building, knocked once, and when James Conley opened the door with a face full of poorly concealed alarm, said, "Mr. Conley, I need a word." The man behind Conley, who was standing in the lamplit back of the office, was shorter than Andrew had expected. Garrett Cole was perhaps 40 years old, with a rancher's tan and a Confederate cavalry officer's posture, and the specific blankness behind the eyes that Andrew associated with men who had decided that other people's suffering was simply the price of business. He was also, Andrew noted, wearing a gun that he had not yet gone for, which meant he was calculating, not panicking. It was Cole who spoke first. "Sheriff," he said, "I understand my associate here has been a model citizen of this fine town." "That is one way to put it," Andrew said. "Mr. Cole, I have a federal warrant for your arrest and one for your associate. I would like this to be uncomplicated." It was not uncomplicated. Cole went for his gun and Conley went for the back door, and there was a terrifying 30 seconds of noise and movement before Conley hit the floor of the alley behind the building where Samuel was waiting, and Cole found himself looking at Andrew's revolver from a distance of 4 feet. "Do not," Andrew said. Cole did not. It was over in 3 minutes, which was less time than Andrew had estimated and more chaotic than he would have preferred. And when it was done, and both men were in irons and Cartwright was producing his federal documentation with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been waiting a long time for this moment, Andrew sat down on the boardwalk outside the brokerage building and took 3 slow, careful breaths. Then he heard Ruth. She was in the doorway of the building, having come downstairs in the commotion, wearing her housecoat with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, looking at the scene in the street with an expression that moved rapidly through shock into comprehension into something harder and more complex. Her eyes found James Conley in irons against the alley wall. They found Garrett Cole sitting in the street with his hands behind his back. And then they found Andrew. And what he saw in her face in that moment was not relief. It was the beginning of a question. The full answer to that question arrived for her, Andrew understood later, not all at once but in pieces, over the following 24 hours. She heard things in the way that information always traveled in a small town, incompletely and from multiple directions. She heard that Andrew had known about Conley for months. She heard that there had been a federal investigation. She heard from some source he never identified that he had known before she had ever come to him with that ledger page. And in the particular and devastating way that hurt works when you trust someone completely, the thing that broke her was not the large betrayal but the small one. That he had known, had been watching, had clearly seen everything that was happening to her in that house, and had not told her. She had come to him with her courage and her hidden evidence and her trust, and she had not known that he was already holding secrets about her husband that dwarfed what she had found. He found her on Main Street at noon the next day, and she had the Colt Navy revolver. He had taken it from her. He had watched her face crack open. And he had understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its completeness, that he had to fix this even though he was not sure he deserved to. He did not try to fix it immediately. He was a man who understood timing, who had spent 6 years learning that the right moment was worth more than 100 premature ones. He let the next 3 days happen. The legal proceedings that Cartwright managed with brisk efficiency. The questioning of Conley that produced enough additional information to dismantle the rest of Cole's Kansas network. The process by which the intimidated ranchers were informed that the title dispute had been fraudulently manufactured, and their properties were secure. He gave Ruth 3 days to feel everything she needed to feel without him trying to manage it or smooth it over. On the 4th day, he knocked on the door of the schoolhouse after hours. She opened it. She looked at him. She stepped back and let him in. The schoolhouse in the late afternoon light was very quiet. The children's slates were stacked neatly on the shelf. The windows let in long bars of May sunshine that fell across the wooden floor in patterns that shifted slowly as the light changed. Ruth sat down on the edge of her teaching desk and crossed her arms, not defensively, but because she was a woman who kept herself contained when she was uncertain, and she looked at him and waited. Andrew took off his hat. He turned it in his hands once. Then he set it on a student's desk and stood before her without it, which was a small thing but felt significant. "I am going to tell you everything," he said. "Not the version that protects the investigation or the version that makes me look reasonable. Everything. And then you can decide what you want to do with it." She nodded. He told her about the letter from Perkins in December. He told her about the conversation with Cartwright, about how to handle her situation. He told her about the argument he had had with Cartwright for 2 hours about whether her safety could be treated as secondary to the investigation, and what conclusion they had reached, and why he had hated the conclusion even while agreeing with it. He told her about the letters in his desk drawer that he had never sent. At the mention of the letters, something shifted in her face. "You wrote me letters," she said. "Yes, and did not send them." "They were not the kind of letters a man sends to a married woman," he said, and did not look away from her, because if he had learned anything from the past 8 months it was that she deserved the full truth at the full cost of his own discomfort. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, a horse went past in the street, and someone called out a greeting to someone else, and the ordinary life of Caldwell continued indifferently around the two of them. "I am angry at you," she said finally. "You have every right to be. I am also," she paused, "aware that what you were doing was the kind of decision that does not have a clean answer, that whatever you chose, someone would be hurt by it." "That is true," he said. "It does not make it right." "No," she agreed. "It does not." Another pause. "How long?" He did not ask her what she meant. "Since the day you walked down Commerce Street without waiting to see if I would follow," he said. Something in her face changed. It was not a softening exactly. It was more like the dropping of a particular kind of weight. "You need to let me be angry for a while longer," she said. "I need that time." "Take all the time you need," he said. "I am not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment. "You never have," she said quietly, and the words contained more than accusation. They contained acknowledgement. He picked up his hat. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "The letters are in the bottom drawer of my desk, under the county maps, if you ever want to read them." He walked back out into the May afternoon and did not look back. She did not come to the sheriff's office for 2 weeks. He did not go to the schoolhouse. He gave her the space she had asked for, which required a discipline that made the time feel physically heavy in a way that had no useful comparison. He did the work of the town. He managed the paperwork that came with a major arrest and a federal investigation. He helped Cartwright coordinate the transport of coal and Conley to Wichita. He listened to Dutch Holly's talk for 45 minutes about how the land title situation was being resolved, and said the appropriate things in the appropriate places. He took Oak Street every morning. He could hear her in the classroom. The fractions, the history lessons, which she had apparently extended to include something about the Plains tribes that the previous teacher had never covered, which generated a significant amount of opinion in the town, and which Ruth appeared to be completely undeterred by. He heard her tell a student with patient firmness that history was not comfortable to learn, and that the discomfort meant you were paying attention, and he stopped walking for a moment because the sentence was so purely and completely her that it went straight through his chest like a clean wind. He walked on. In the 3rd week of May, on a Tuesday afternoon, he came back from a ride out to the Hollies ranch to find a single piece of paper on his desk. It was one of his own letters. She had folded it and returned it opened, with 4 words written at the bottom in her precise schoolteacher's hand. The words said, "You write very well." He sat down and read the letter again, which was 3 pages of handwriting that he had initially been mortified by, and had then decided to keep, because destroying it had felt like a kind of cowardice. He read it with the knowledge that she had read it, and the quality of the silence in the office was different than it had been that morning. He wrote back. He sent the reply with Samuel, who delivered it to the schoolhouse without comment, and returned with an expression of elaborate neutrality that suggested he was exercising considerable self-restraint. The exchange of letters continued for 10 days. They were not the halting, careful correspondences of people who did not know each other. They were the letters of 2 people who had been paying close attention to each other for 8 months and had a great deal stored up. She wrote about what she had thought the morning of the arrest, the specific texture of understanding that comes when a picture you have been building privately suddenly completes itself. He wrote about the decision with Cartwright and all the reasons he stood behind it, and all the reasons it still sat badly with him. She wrote about Cincinnati, about what her life had looked like before James Conley, and the particular series of desperate choices that had led to their marriage, which she had entered into with clear eyes and inadequate information, and which she did not frame as victimhood, but as a decision she had made with what she had at the time. He wrote back that the capacity to understand one's own choices without either excusing or condemning them was one of the rarest things he had encountered in a human being. She came to the sheriff's office on a Saturday morning in early June. She walked in without knocking, the way that Samuel did, which told him something. She was wearing a pale blue dress he had not seen before, and her hair was down, loose and dark around her shoulders, and she was carrying a small basket that contained, he discovered, 2 cups and a tin of coffee. She set the basket on his desk. She poured 2 cups from the small pot he kept on the stove without asking if he wanted any. She sat down in the chair across from his desk and looked at him with those direct green eyes, and she said, "I have decided to stop being angry." "How did you arrive at that decision?" he asked, because he was genuinely curious. "I asked myself whether being angry was making me feel safer," she said, "or whether it was just something to hold on to because what was on the other side of it felt uncertain." She picked up her coffee cup. It was the second thing. Andrew looked at her across his desk in the morning light coming through the window, with the sound of Caldwell going about its Saturday business outside, and all the letters and all the careful waiting and all the 6 years of ordinary steadiness before she had arrived coalesced into a single clear moment. "Ruth," he said. "Andrew," she said, "I would very much like to take you to dinner tonight, properly, at the hotel dining room, if you would like that." "I would like that," she said, and her smile, when it came, was small and private and completely real, and it was the most beautiful thing Andrew Haskins had seen in 34 years of life. The dinner at the hotel dining room was the beginning of something that Caldwell watched with the particular interested attention that small frontier towns give to developments that affect people they have grown fond of. Ruth Conley was well liked. Andrew Haskins was respected, and the two of them together, sitting across from each other at a table by the window with the summer evening light going golden on the street outside, generated a kind of collective warmth in the town that expressed itself in knowing nods between the women of the Tuesday sewing circle and a round of drinks bought at the saloon by Dutch Hollies, who declared that it was about time. The dinner lasted 3 hours. They talked about everything. She told him about growing up in Ohio with a schoolteacher mother who had given her her love of teaching and her habit of assessing people for what they actually were rather than what they presented. He told her about growing up on a farm in Indiana and coming west at 22 with the intention of finding something that felt like a purpose, which he had found not in the gold fields or the cattle drives, but in the improbable venue of a sheriff's office in a Kansas border town. She laughed at things he said, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and the sound of it reset something in him that had been running wrong for a long time. He walked her home after dinner to the boarding house where she had moved after the arrest, and they stood on the front step in the warm June evening, and the air between them was full of everything that had been building for 8 months and that was now, finally, in the right place to exist openly. "I should go in," she said. "Yes," he agreed, not moving. She looked at him. He looked at her. Then she put her hand on his chest, just briefly, just once, a touch that was soft and deliberate and certain, and she said, "Good night, Andrew," and went inside. He stood on the step for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he walked back through the summer evening to the sheriff's office and sat down at his desk and did not write any letters because there was nothing he needed to store up anymore. He just sat with the feeling, which was large and warm and entirely new, and let it be what it was. They began spending time together in ways that were honest and uncomplicated. Sunday mornings, they rode out to the river, where the cottonwood trees had gone fully green with the summer, and the water ran clear over flat limestone. Ruth rowed well, competently and without performance, and she had a particular fondness for the shallow crossing half a mile downstream, where the current braided around a sandbar, and kingfishers worked the water with a precision that she found deeply satisfying to watch. He brought a fishing line twice and caught nothing both times, which she found funnier than he felt it deserved, and which he accepted as a reasonable tax on the pleasure of hearing her laugh. She told him things he was careful not to treat as revelations, because she did not offer them as things that required special handling. She told him about the early months of her marriage, which had shown her James Conley's capacity for casual cruelty before she had fully understood what she had walked into, and the precise way that his ability to be convincingly charming in public had made the private reality harder to name. She told him that the worst part had not been the physical incidents, but the sustained effort of maintaining her sense of her own reality against the constant quiet pressure of a man who wanted her to believe that nothing was as bad as she thought. Andrew listened without rushing toward reassurance or toward anger, which she said later was one of the things she had needed most and had expected least. He told her about the loneliness of the job, the specific kind that comes from being the person everyone looks to for steadiness, from never being the one who gets to be uncertain in public, from living in a town for 6 years and knowing everyone and being genuinely fond of them and nonetheless going home at night to an empty house with the sense that some essential connection was missing. "That is exactly it," she said when he described it. "That exact feeling. I have had it my whole adult life." "And now?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, watching the kingfisher on its branch above the water. "Now it is less," she said, "considerably less." They sat beside the river in the July heat, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that did not require filling. It was on one of those Sunday mornings in the second week of July that he told her about the dark chapter he had kept to himself. He told her about a man he had killed in his second year as sheriff. A young man, barely 20, who had come into town drunk and armed and had made bad decisions in rapid succession, and who had died in the alley behind the saloon with Andrew's bullet in him. The legal finding had been justified. The practical reality of the situation had been justified. Andrew had processed both of these facts correctly at the time and had also been unable to fully resolve, in the 6 years since, the weight of having taken a life from someone who might have made different choices in different circumstances. He told her this because he wanted her to know the full accounting, because he had asked her to trust him with her truths, and he understood that trust was not a one-way mechanism. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. "Do you know what the hardest part is?" she said. "When something real and difficult has happened, and the people around you try to smooth it over because they are uncomfortable with it. As if your feelings about it are a problem to be managed rather than a true response to a true thing." "Yes," he said. "You have been carrying that alone," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the grass beside the river, and she did not say anything else, and the silence was not empty. It was the full and weighted silence of being genuinely understood by another person, which is one of the rarest and most valuable things in the world, and which neither of them took lightly. He asked her to marry him on a Saturday evening in August, on the front porch of the boarding house, with the summer night loud with crickets and the smell of the prairie coming through the warm air. He had not planned a speech. He was not that kind of man, and she was not the kind of woman who wanted one. He simply said what was true, that he had loved her from the first morning she walked down Commerce Street without waiting to see if he would follow, that he was better at his own life with her in it than he had ever been without her, and that he wanted, if she would have him, to spend the rest of whatever time they had building something together that was real and chosen and theirs. She said yes with tears in her eyes and her chin up, and that particular Ruth Conley quality of feeling everything deeply while refusing to be diminished by it. And when he kissed her for the first time on that porch with Caldwell asleep around them, it was the most complete thing he had ever done. They were married in September of 1882. The ceremony was small and specific, held in the white clapboard church on Elm Street on a Saturday afternoon, with the September light coming through the windows in long amber bars. Samuel Holt served as best man, which he did with an expression of such profound satisfaction that the pastor had to remind him twice to hand over the ring because Samuel was too busy beaming at the congregation. The women of the Tuesday sewing circle occupied the first 3 rows on the bride's side and produced a collective quantity of happy tears that impressed even those of the townspeople who had believed themselves to be unsentimental. Ruth wore a dress she had made herself from fabric that the owner of the general store had ordered specially from Kansas City, a deep green silk that matched her eyes and that she had constructed with the same precise attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. She carried wildflowers from the river. She walked herself down the aisle. Andrew watched her come toward him and thought that the 6 years before she arrived in Caldwell had been necessary in the same way that long dry seasons were necessary, because without them you did not properly understand the value of rain. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, but the way they said them was not traditional. They said them with the particular gravity of 2 people who had each, in different ways, arrived at this moment through damage and survival and careful, chosen trust, and who therefore understood what the words meant in a way that easy happiness could not teach. The reception was held in the church hall, with fiddle music and dancing, and a wedding cake that Mrs. Briggs from the telegraph office had made despite having no prior occasion to make one, which resulted in a cake that was structurally confident if asymmetrical, and which everyone declared delicious in tones that suggested they meant it. Dutch Hollies bought multiple rounds at the saloon afterward on behalf of the groom, which was a gesture that a married man could appreciate more in principle than in practice, and which Samuel availed himself of thoroughly enough that Andrew had to remind him the next morning that they were still technically on duty. The new house was on the north end of Caldwell, a solid wood frame structure with a porch on the front and a kitchen garden in the back that Ruth began planning before they had finished moving in. Andrew had bought it in August, had spent the weekends of August and early September repairing the porch boards and painting the window frames and building the shelving in the kitchen that he knew she would want, and the satisfaction of building something with his own hands for a specific and beloved purpose was a new kind of pleasure that he had not previously had access to. She filled the house with her presence in the way that certain people fill a space, not with noise or drama, but with a quality of attention that made things feel inhabited and considered. She had strong opinions about where the furniture should go, and she was right about all of them, and he told her so. She planted kitchen herbs in the garden and came inside smelling of rosemary and warm earth, and he found this the most complicated kind of wonderful. They sat on the front porch in the evenings when the Kansas sky went enormous and purple above the plains, and they talked, or they did not talk, and either way the space between them had that quality of rightness that neither of them wasted time on questioning, because it was too good to spend on anything but gratitude. In November of 1882, Ruth told him she was expecting their first child. She told him on a Tuesday morning before school, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her coffee, with the November light gray through the window, her face calm and her eyes watchful in the way that told him she was monitoring his response carefully, and he sat with it for exactly 2 seconds before crossing to her and pulling her into his arms and holding her with the fullness of everything he felt, which was large and warm and complete and terrifying in the best possible way. "Are you frightened?" she asked into his shoulder. "Yes," he said. "Are you?" "Enormously," she said, and then muffled, "Also very happy." "Also very happy," he agreed. The pregnancy was something Ruth moved through with the same practical seriousness she brought to everything, though Andrew noticed that she allowed herself, in private, to be more uncertain than she was publicly, and he was careful to be the person she could be uncertain with. She continued teaching until March, When the school board made pointed observations about the impropriety of a visibly pregnant woman instructing children, to which she responded with a patience that he recognized as barely contained irritation, and she stopped only because the alternative was a conflict that would take time she preferred to spend preparing for the baby. She was not easy to watch slow down, because she was not built for it and they both knew it, and she channeled the energy she had previously put into teaching into reorganizing the house twice and starting a correspondence with a women's school in Wichita about a potential teaching position that might allow more flexibility in the future. Andrew, for his part, discovered that he was more capable of tenderness than he had previously given himself credit for. He had always been competent at caring for things in a practical sense: the town, the law, the operational requirements of keeping a small community functional. But caring for a person, not as a duty but as the chosen and specific focus of everything warm in him, was different in ways he had not mapped in advance. He was surprised by his own desire to be present for every ordinary thing, to know that she had slept well, to notice when she was tired and say so, to learn the particular vocabulary of what she needed without requiring her to always name it. He was not always perfect at it. He had spent 34 years being largely self-contained, and self-containment does not always know how to get out of the way of connection. There were moments when she needed him to be less sheriff and more husband, to put down the professional steadiness and let something more personal through, and he was still learning where that line was, and she was patient with the learning in the way that she was patient with everything that was genuinely trying. Their son was born in June of 1883. He arrived early on a Tuesday morning with the summer already establishing itself in the heat of the Kansas air, and the midwife, Mrs. Callahan, who had delivered half the children in Caldwell, pronounced him healthy with the satisfied efficiency of a woman who had done this enough to know immediately what she was looking at. He was solid and dark-haired and alarmingly loud for his size, and when Andrew held him for the first time, with Ruth watching from the bed with the specific exhausted triumph of someone who has just done something genuinely difficult, he felt the ground shift under everything he had previously believed himself to know about what mattered. They named him Thomas William Haskins, Thomas for Ruth's father and William for Andrew's, and he spent the first weeks of his life in a state of loud and absolute certainty about what he wanted, which Andrew found simultaneously exhausting and admirable. Caldwell received the news of the baby's arrival with the warmth it typically reserved for things that confirmed its own good feeling about itself, and the front porch of the Haskins house received a parade of visitors bearing food and blankets and advice that was only partially solicited, all of which Ruth managed with her customary grace, and a private amusement she shared with Andrew in the evenings when the visitors had gone. The year following Thomas's birth established the shape of their life together in a way that had a quality of rightness that Andrew still, 18 months into their marriage, caught himself pausing over with something that was almost disbelief. Not because it was fragile or unlikely, but because he had not previously known that it was possible to be this settled in his own existence. He had spent so long being the person who stabilized others that the experience of being stabilized by something, by someone, was genuinely new and genuinely good. Ruth went back to teaching in the fall of 1883, part-time initially and then full-time by spring, with Thomas's care managed through a combination of Mrs. Callahan on weekday mornings and Andrew adjusting his own schedule on the afternoons when he could. The school board had objections that Ruth addressed with the same directness she brought to everything that needed addressing, and eventually the sheer evidence of her competence in the classroom won the argument more persuasively than any words could have. Andrew found himself proud of her in a way that went beyond the ordinary spousal variety. It was the specific pride of watching someone do the thing they were built for and being close enough to see all the work that went into making it look natural. In the spring of 1884, Cartwright came back to Caldwell. The visit was official. The trials of Cole and Conley had wound through the federal court system with the slowness characteristic of such proceedings, and the final sentencing had come down in March. Cole received 15 years in federal prison. Conley, who had cooperated significantly with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced charge, received 8 years. Cartwright came to inform Andrew personally, which Andrew appreciated, and to review some outstanding documentation related to the land fraud case, which the affected ranchers had successfully prosecuted in civil court with the assistance of a Wichita attorney. Cartwright stayed for dinner, which Ruth prepared with the particular focused generosity she brought to feeding people who had been important to outcomes she cared about. The three of them sat at the kitchen table with Thomas asleep in the back room, and the meal was excellent, and Cartwright was visibly surprised by both of those things in a way that made Andrew realize the man had never expected to see him like this, settled and domestic and deeply content, and had perhaps assumed that a man of Andrew's particular temperament would not have known what to do with happiness. Cartwright said, before he left, "I owe you an apology, Haskins. The argument I made about the woman being secondary to the investigation, I was wrong, not just about this situation, as a general principle." Andrew shook his hand. "I appreciate that," he said. "Your wife is remarkable," Cartwright said. "She is," Andrew agreed, and did not add anything to it because the statement was complete. After Cartwright left, Ruth washed the dishes and Andrew dried them, which was their habitual division, and the kitchen was warm and quiet and smelled of the rosemary she had cooked with, and Thomas made a small sound from the back room that settled back into silence, and Andrew set down the dish he was holding and put his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on top of her head and felt, with absolute clarity, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I am glad you came to Caldwell," he said. She turned in his arms and looked up at him. "Even with everything that came with it. Especially with everything that came with it," he said. "Because it brought you here, and that is what mattered." She kissed him, slow and deliberate and certain, the way she did everything. The years that followed in Caldwell were not without difficulty, because no life of substance is, but they were full in the way that matters, and the difficulty was the honest kind, the kind that comes from building something real rather than from secrets and hidden motives and traps. The town grew, as Kansas towns were growing in the mid-1880s, as the railroads pushed further and the cattle drives continued, and new families arrived with the particular determined hope of people who had decided to build their future somewhere that had room for it. Andrew was re-elected as sheriff in 1884 with no opposition, which Samuel pointed out was a new record, and which Andrew accepted with the equanimity of a man who had made peace with the job and understood what it was worth. He had begun to think about the longer term, about what Caldwell would look like in a decade, about whether the town had the institutional structures it would need as it grew, and he started working with the county commissioner on some of these questions with an energy that surprised people who had thought of him as purely a law enforcement figure. Ruth's career continued its expansion. By 1885, she was not only teaching full-time, but had become something of a quiet center of gravity for the educational life of the town, corresponding with schools and institutions in Kansas City and Topeka, advocating for a second classroom and an expanded school year with the tenacious patience that she brought to anything she believed insufficiently. She won most of these arguments, which surprised no one who had paid attention. She also, in 1885, began a friendship with a woman named Clara Running Horse, the wife of a Wichita Indian agent who had come to Caldwell on business related to the land resettlement proceedings. Clara was a call woman who had the bearing of someone accustomed to navigating two worlds simultaneously, and the dry humor of someone who had been doing it long enough to find it more interesting than exhausting. Ruth recognized something in her immediately, the same quality of inhabiting her own reality clearly despite the pressures on it. And the friendship that developed was a genuine one that lasted and deepened over the subsequent years. Through Clara, Ruth began to understand more fully the history of the land her town sat on, and this understanding worked its way into her teaching in ways that continued to generate controversy, and that she continued to be entirely undeterred by. Andrew backed her completely on this, not least because the history was true, and he had always believed that the truth was worth whatever discomfort it caused. They had their second child in 1886, a girl this time, born in February with the prairie outside white with snow and the house warm and close with firelight. They named her Alina, after no one in particular, but because it was a strong name that fit her immediately. A child who arrived with dark eyes that assessed her new surroundings with a seriousness that made the midwife laugh and Ruth say, "Well, she is absolutely yours." The Haskins house on the north end of Caldwell became, over the years, the kind of house that people were glad to visit. Not because it was large or expensively furnished, but because of the quality of welcome in it, which came from Ruth, and which Andrew had learned, by close observation and willing participation, to contribute to in his own more reserved way. Thomas grew into a boy of serious intelligence and enormous physical energy, who deeply frustrated Andrew's attempts to keep him from climbing things he should not be climbing, and Alina grew into a child whose combination of her mother's directness and her father's steadiness produced, at the age of 2, a personality that the entire town found simultaneously alarming and delightful. Samuel Holt eventually married a woman named Josephine who arrived in Caldwell in 1885 to visit her cousin and stayed, because she found Samuel more interesting than she had expected to find anyone in Kansas. And the two couples became the kind of friends who had Sunday dinners together and knew each other's children's middle names and could be honest with each other in the full, uncalculated way that comes from years of proven loyalty. In 1887, Andrew did something he had been thinking about for 2 years. He sat Ruth down at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, with Thomas outside in the garden doing something that involved a great deal of noise, and Alina sitting on the floor nearby categorizing her toys with the systematic focus of a person who had strong feelings about organizational systems. And he told Ruth that he wanted to stop being sheriff when his current term ended in 1888. He did not tell her this because he was done with Caldwell or because the work had lost its meaning. He told her because he had been carrying the job since he was 28 years old and he had arrived, by the slow accumulation of 6 years of his life with her, at a clear understanding of what he wanted the next part of his life to look like, and the badge was not the center of it. He wanted to run for county commissioner. The work he had started with the commissioner's office on the structural needs of the growing county had shown him a kind of civic problem-solving that engaged him differently than law enforcement did, broader and more constructive in its scope, and he thought he could do it well. He also wanted, simply, to be home more. To be less of the person the whole town relied on for their steadiness, and more of the person this particular house relied on for its own. Ruth looked at him across the table for a long moment. Alina arranged 3 tin soldiers in a row with careful precision. Outside, Thomas fell off something and then immediately began explaining at volume why it was not his fault. "I think you should do it," Ruth said. "You do not need to think about it longer." "I do not," she said. "I have been watching you do this for 5 years. You give everything to the town and everything you have left over to us, and you are good at both, and I love you for it. But the county commission work lights you up differently. I have noticed that for 2 years." She paused. "Besides, if you are home more, Thomas might stop climbing the barn roof when you are on patrol." "He will absolutely not stop climbing the barn roof," Andrew said. "No," she agreed. "He will not, but at least you will be there to see it." They both laughed, and Alina looked up from her soldiers to see what was happening, and then went back to the soldiers, and the morning continued in all its ordinary fullness. Andrew served out his term as sheriff through 1888. handing the office over to Samuel in a transition that was smooth and sensible, and that Samuel managed with the quiet competence of a man who had been preparing for it for years without acknowledging that he was doing so. The town, which had fully expected Andrew Haskins to remain sheriff until he physically could not continue, took a week to adjust to the idea, and then decided that if he believed Samuel was the right choice, they would believe it too, which was a form of trust that Andrew felt the full weight of and tried to merit by making the handover as thorough and organized as possible. The commissioner campaign was uncomplicated in the sense that Andrew ran it the way he did everything, straightforwardly, on the basis of what he actually intended to do, without the political gloss that some of the other candidates applied. He won by a margin that suggested the voters of Caldwell County had decided that 6 years of watching him be consistently honest in a position that permitted dishonesty was a more persuasive credential than most campaign promises. Ruth celebrated his win with a dinner that included Dutch Hollies and his wife, Samuel and Josephine, Mrs. Briggs and Clara Running Horse, who had ridden in from the agency specifically for the occasion and who brought, as a gift, a beaded leather case for documents that was so beautiful that Andrew kept it on his desk for the rest of his working life. He began the commissioner work in January of 1889 with the same methodical approach he had brought to everything, learning what needed learning, building the relationships that needed building, applying the particular form of patience that is required when the thing you are trying to accomplish is structural rather than immediate. Ruth, who was better at this kind of long-view patience than almost anyone he had ever met, was his primary thinking partner on the larger questions, and the kitchen table on Sunday mornings became, over the years, a kind of informal policy workshop that produced ideas that eventually made their way into actual decisions affecting the lives of actual people in Caldwell County. The school that Ruth had been pushing for since 1884 finally broke ground in 1889. A proper 2-room schoolhouse with a separate classroom for the older students, and a library room that was small but real. And the day the doors opened in September of 1889 was the day Andrew watched his wife walk through those doors in her professional capacity and understood, for the 100th or 1,000th time, what it meant that she had come to this town and stayed in it and made it hers. He was standing at the back of the room when she called the first class to order. The older students now, the 12 and 13-year-olds who needed the room, and she stood at the front with the easy authority of someone who had been doing this for 7 years and who had fought for this particular room and who was now fully in it. And she turned to write something on the board, and he saw Thomas in the 3rd row watching his mother with an expression of uncomplicated pride that was so entirely familiar that Andrew had to look at the ceiling for a moment. He walked home in the September afternoon and thought about November of 1882, about the woman standing outside the stage depot with the worn trunk and the direct green eyes, and about the particular grace of lives that turn out to be made of exactly the right materials, assembled by exactly the right forces, at exactly the right time. Their 3rd child arrived in 1890, another boy, which Thomas greeted with the strategic satisfaction of someone who had been outnumbered by his sister for 4 years, and saw this as a structural correction. They named him James, which Ruth chose with a deliberateness that Andrew recognized, taking a name that had been attached to damage and giving it to something new and good, which was the specific kind of courage that was most Ruth of all. James Haskins was a boy of exceptional cheerfulness, who appeared to have been born with the belief that the world was fundamentally in his favor, a quality that stood in such complete contrast to his parents' hard-won optimism that they found it almost theoretical. Eleanor, who was 4 by this point, received her younger brother with the systematic assessment of a person who was determining whether this development was acceptable, concluded that it was, and proceeded to educate him about the proper categorization of objects starting from approximately his 3rd week of life. The years moved through their seasons with the full, textured quality of time that is well spent. Andrew continued the commissioner work through the early 1890s, building the county road system that the growing population needed, working on the water rights legislation that was becoming the defining conflict of Kansas agricultural life, advocating for school funding in ways that occasionally put him in conflict with the county treasurer, and always put him in agreement with his wife. He was re-elected in 1891 and again in 1895, and the arc of what he built in that role was quiet and solid and real, the kind of work that does not make anyone famous, but that people who live with its results for decades come to understand as genuinely valuable. Samuel ran Caldwell's sheriff's office with the same steady competence that he had brought to every job Andrew had ever given him, and the town continued to grow and shift and manage its frontier tensions with the particular mix of roughness and genuine community feeling that characterized Kansas border towns in the late 19th century. It was not easy. It was not supposed to be easy. But it was, increasingly, a real place with real institutions, and that was what the work had always been for. In the summer of 1895, Ruth organized a reading group that included Clara Running Horse and 4 other women from different backgrounds, 2 of them from Mennonite farming families who had settled north of town in the late 1880s, one a freedwoman named Adelaide who had come to Kansas in 1879 with the Exoduster migration, and had built a life in Caldwell with the specific determination of someone who understood what freedom was worth. The group met on Wednesday evenings in the Haskins kitchen, and the conversations that came out of those meetings were, by all accounts, the kind that change how people think about things, which is the most valuable kind of conversation there is. Andrew listened to the edges of these meetings when he happened to be home, fetching water or bringing more firewood, not intending to participate but often drawn in by the quality of the discussion, and he was continually aware of the way Ruth held the space, not by controlling it, but by asking the questions that made people go further into what they actually thought, and by being genuinely interested in the answers in a way that could not be performed. He told her once, late at night after one of these meetings, that he thought she would have been extraordinary in any century, in any place. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to direct statements. "I think you might be romanticizing slightly," she said. "Possibly," he agreed. "I have been known to do that." "You," she looked at him with mock surprise. "The sheriff who writes letters he does not send." "Former sheriff," he said. "Always a sheriff," she said, and the warmth in her voice when she said it was the warmth of someone who has learned all the shapes of another person and has made complete peace with every one of them. He pulled her close in the darkness and held her with the fullness of everything the years had built between them, which was considerable and specific and wholly theirs. Thomas graduated from the new school in 1897 at the age of 14, which was the age at which formal schooling in Caldwell County effectively ended for most students, and announced his intention to study law, which he had decided upon at the age of 11 and had not deviated from since. This required going to Kansas City, which he did with the combination of confidence and competence that his parents had somehow produced in him despite, or perhaps because of, their own careful ways. Andrew drove him to the Caldwell Stage Depot on a September morning in 1897, which was the same depot where he had first seen Ruth 15 years earlier, and he stood on the platform with his son and felt the full, circular weight of time passing in a way that was not sad but was enormously large. Thomas shook his hand, which was the right thing for a 14-year-old young man to do, and then hugged him, which was also the right thing, and climbed onto the stage, and was gone south into the Kansas morning. Andrew stood on the platform for a moment. Then he walked home, not along Main Street but along Oak Street, past the schoolhouse where a new young teacher was putting the first lessons of the fall term on the board, and past the church where he and Ruth had been married, and past the Hollies feed store where Dutch Hollies was loading grain sacks with the help of his youngest son, and he arrived home to find Alina at the kitchen table with her schoolbooks and James in the garden, with a stick that was serving some purpose that Andrew decided not to investigate, and Ruth in the kitchen making bread, and the house full of the smell of flour and yeast, and the particular warmth of a life that was well and truly inhabited. She looked up when he came in. "How did you leave him?" she asked. "Well," Andrew said, "he is ready." "He is," Ruth agreed. She turned back to the bread and then turned back to him. "Come here." He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her at the counter, and she put her floury hand on his arm, and they stood together in the warm kitchen, while Alina read at the table and James accomplished whatever he was accomplishing in the garden, and Caldwell went about its Monday morning outside the window. And the particular quality of the moment was one that neither of them tried to name, because naming it would have been smaller than what it was. In 1900, Andrew Haskins retired from the county commissioner position. He was 52 years old. He had worn a badge or held office in Caldwell County for 24 years, which was a span of time that, when he calculated it, seemed both impossibly long and completely natural. Ruth was 45, still teaching 4 days a week, still running the reading group, still corresponding with Clara running Horse and Adelaide and the women's school in Topeka, and a dozen other people and institutions that she had accumulated over the years like evidence of the kind of life she had chosen to live. Alina, at 14, had developed a passion for mathematics that had outpaced what the Caldwell School could teach her, and was exchanging letters with a female professor at the University of Kansas, who had agreed to review her work. James, at 10, remained deeply cheerful and had added to his educational portfolio an encyclopedic knowledge of Kansas bird species that his father found impressive and his sister found inexplicable. Thomas wrote from Kansas City monthly, long and detailed letters full of what he was learning that made Andrew and Ruth sit down together after dinner to read them, passing the pages back and forth, arguing occasionally about the legal points Thomas raised with the particular pleasure of parents whose children have become interesting people. On the evening of Andrew's last official day as commissioner, Ruth made dinner for just the 4 of them, a meal that she spent all afternoon on, not because it needed to be elaborate but because she was a person who marked things properly. They sat at the kitchen table that had been the center of 20 years of Sunday mornings and Wednesday evenings and daily ordinary life, and Alina asked her father what he was going to do now, with the directness of a girl who had never seen the point of asking questions at an angle. "I am going to be here," Andrew said. Alina thought about this. "You have always been here," she said. "More here," Andrew said. "Different kind of here." James, who had been thinking, said, "Can we get a dog?" The table erupted in the specific chaos of a family that knows itself well enough to be funny together, and Ruth caught Andrew's eye across it all, and the look between them contained 20 years of everything they had built together, which was more than most people got and which they had never, for a single day, taken for granted. He had looked after this town for years. He had kept it safe and steady through its roughest edges and its growing pains and its particular brand of frontier difficulty, with a consistency that had cost him things he had not known he was paying and given him back things he had not known he was missing. But he had never, in all those years of wearing the badge and carrying the town, looked after anyone the way he looked after Ruth. He had never given that quality of attention and care and chosen, daily presence to a person who gave it back in full measure, who made him more himself than he had been before she arrived, who had walked down Commerce Street in the November cold without waiting to see if he would follow and had somehow, in the act of leading, brought him exactly to where he needed to be. He reached across the table and took her hand. She looked at him, and she did not need to ask what he was thinking because she knew, the way she had always known, with the complete and particular knowledge of a woman who had spent 20 years paying close attention to a man who was worth it. Outside, the Kansas evening was enormous and purple above the plains, the way it had always been, the way it would continue to be long after all of them were gone. The crickets were starting up in the long grass behind the house. Somewhere on Main Street, someone was playing a harmonica. The dog, which James had not yet successfully lobbied for but which would appear by Christmas, Andrew had already decided, was going to be a good-natured brown creature that would sleep on the porch and endear itself to the whole family within a week. Eleanor went back to her mathematics and James elaborated his proposal for the dog, and the evening moved through its comfortable course. And Andrew Haskins sat at his own kitchen table in the town he had served for 24 years and felt, with the full capacity of a man who had learned what he was capable of by discovering what he was for, that he was entirely, unreservedly, home. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the year 1900, was not the same rough border settlement it had been when Andrew first pinned on the badge in 1876. It had grown and complicated itself, and acquired the infrastructure of something that intended to last. The new schoolhouse, the county road that ran straight and properly graded from the south edge of town to the Hollies Ranch, the water ordinance that Andrew had fought for in 1893, and that had saved 3 farms from drought the following summer, the library books that Ruth had organized a campaign to acquire, and that now occupied 3 full shelves in the school library room. All of it was built from the accumulated work of people who had decided that this particular piece of Kansas prairie was worth the effort of making it something real. And at the center of it, in the house on the north end of town, with the kitchen garden and the front porch and the kitchen table where everything important had been talked through, were 2 people who had found each other at the intersection of duty and damage and possibility, and who had chosen, every day since, to build something together that was worthy of what they had each survived to reach it. The stories that towns tell about themselves change over time. The rough edges get smoothed in the telling, the compromises and mistakes get footnoted or forgotten, the things that people got wrong get quietly set aside in favor of the more comfortable narrative. This is the nature of how communities make meaning from their own histories, and it is not always wrong. Some things are worth setting aside, but the story that Caldwell told about its sheriff in the years after he left the office was one of the true ones. It was a story about a man who had kept his word to a town for a long time, who had been honest in a position that allowed for dishonesty, who had built something with his steadiness that outlasted any particular threat or difficulty, and who had, in the end, found the thing that made the steadiness worth having. He had looked after this town for years, and the town, in the particular way that places honor people who have genuinely served them, looked after the knowledge of what he had done. But the best part of the story, the part that Ruth would have told you herself if you had asked, was simpler than all of it. It was just this, that a man with a badge and a hollow place in his chest and 6 years of faithful, lonely service had looked up one November afternoon and seen a woman walking down Commerce Street without waiting to see if anyone would follow, and had followed her anyway, and had kept following her for the rest of his life. And she had known he was behind her from the very first step, and she had kept walking just far enough ahead to make sure he kept coming. That was the whole of it. That was all of it, and it was enough, and it was everything, and it was real.